The sun dipped low over Lake Serenity, casting a golden hue across the rippling water, a sight that had drawn me to purchase the sprawling lakefront property years ago. My name is Arjun Khan, a real estate investor with a penchant for quiet retreats, and this lakeside community in upstate New York was my latest acquisition. I'd bought the entire development, 16 cottages, a clubhouse, and the surrounding land, intending to rent them out as vacation homes. The tenants were a mix of families, retirees, and young professionals, all drawn to the idyllic charm of the lake. But peace was never guaranteed, not when Karen Mitchell lived in Cottage 12. Karen, a wiry woman in her late 50s with a penchant for floral blouses and an unrelenting need to control, had declared herself the unofficial president of the Lake Serenity Homeowners Association, an HOA that didn't exist. I'd heard whispers about her from other tenants, her insistence on community standards, her nosy inspections of lawns, and her endless complaints about everything from mailbox colors to the improper parking of kayaks. I'd chosen to stay hands-off, managing the properties through a local agent, but Karen's latest crusade was about to pull me into the fray. It started with a letter, hand-delivered to my city office, demanding that I, as the new owner of Cottage 1, join her HOA or face consequences. I laughed it off. After all, I owned the entire development. Why would I join an HOA for my own land? But Karen wasn't one to back down. Her letter was filled with legalese, citing community bylaws that she'd apparently invented, and a threat to escalate matters if I didn't comply. I tossed the letter into a drawer, assuming she'd tire herself out. I was wrong. A week later, my agent called, frantic, saying Karen had rallied half the tenants for a mandatory HOA meeting and was demanding my presence. I declined, citing my busy schedule, but curiosity gnawed at me. Who was this woman, and why did she think she could dictate terms to me? I decided to visit Lake Serenity that weekend, not as a tenant, but as the landlord, ready to set things straight. The drive up was peaceful, the autumn leaves painting the hills in fiery reds and oranges, but I knew a storm was brewing. Karen's audacity was amusing, but her interference with my tenants was not. I arrived at Cottage 1, my personal retreat, and found a new letter taped to the door, this time threatening legal action if I didn't pay the HOA dues of $500. I crumpled it in my fist, my amusement turning to irritation. This was my property, my rules. Karen was about to learn that. The next morning, I woke to the sound of banging on my door. Bleary-eyed, I opened it to find Karen, clipboard in hand, her lips pursed in a tight line. "Mr. Khan," she began, her voice dripping with condescension, "you've ignored my letters and now you're in violation of Lake Serenity's community standards." I blinked, still processing the audacity of this woman standing on my porch, lecturing me about my own property. She thrust a stack of papers at me, her so-called HOA bylaws, a 20-page document outlining rules for everything from fence heights to acceptable flower bed plants. I scanned the first page, noting the absurdity. No inflatable pool floats allowed, no outdoor music after 7 p.m., and a mandatory $50 fine for unapproved mailbox designs. "Karen," I said, keeping my tone even, "there is no HOA here. I own this land, all of it." Her eyes narrowed and she jabbed a finger at me. "You may own that cottage, but the community has standards and you will comply." I almost laughed at her confidence, but her next words stopped me cold. "If you don't join the HOA and pay the dues, I'll have no choice but to report you to the authorities for non-compliance." I stared at her, incredulous. "Report me? For what?" I invited her inside, hoping to reason with her, but she refused, saying she had inspections to conduct. As she marched off, I noticed a few tenants peeking from their windows, their faces a mix of amusement and fear. Karen's reign of terror was clearly well established. I spent the day reviewing my property records, confirming what I already knew. I owned every inch of Lake Serenity, including the land under Karen's cottage. There were no covenants or restrictions in the deeds that allowed for an HOA, let alone one led by a tenant. I called my lawyer Priya, who laughed when I recounted the situation. "She's got no legal standing," Priya assured me, "but she sounds like trouble. You might want to address this head on." I agreed, but first I wanted to understand Karen's influence. I visited a few tenants that afternoon, starting with Mr. and Mrs. Patel in Cottage 3. They were a kind elderly couple who'd been renting for 2 years. "She's relentless," Mrs. Patel whispered, glancing nervously toward Karen's cottage. "She fined us $100 for planting tulips instead of roses." I assured them the fines were unenforceable, but their fear was palpable. Karen had created a miniature dictatorship, and I was determined to dismantle it. That evening, I attended the mandatory HOA meeting at the clubhouse, a quaint wooden building I'd renovated last year. Karen stood at a podium, addressing a dozen tenants with the authority of a small-town mayor. She wore a blazer over her floral blouse, a name tag proclaiming her President Mitchell. The agenda included community beautification projects, funded by her fictitious dues, and a vote to sanction non-compliant residents, namely, me. I sat in the back unnoticed, listening as she ranted about the new owner of Cottage 1, painting me as a reckless outsider who threatened their way of life. The tenants nodded, some out of agreement, others out of intimidation. I raised my hand and Karen's eyes locked onto me, her expression souring. "Yes, Mr. Khan?" she said, her tone icy. I stood, smiling calmly. "I'd like to clarify something. There is no HOA at Lake Serenity. I own this entire development, including the land you're standing on. Your bylaws have no legal weight." The room fell silent, the tenants exchanging shocked glances. Karen's face reddened. "That's absurd," she snapped. "This community has had an HOA for years." I pulled out my phone, displaying the deed to the property, and passed it to the tenant beside me. "Check for yourself," I said. "No HOA exists." Karen sputtered, accusing me of forging documents, but the tenants were already murmuring, their trust in her wavering. I left the meeting expecting that to be the end of it, but Karen was far from done. The next morning, I found a police cruiser parked outside my cottage. 2 officers stood on my porch, Karen beside them, arms crossed triumphantly. "This is the non-compliant resident," she told them, pointing at me. The officers explained they'd received a complaint about unpermitted activities on my property. I invited them inside, showed them my ownership documents, and explained the situation. They listened, their expressions shifting from confusion to amusement. "Ma'am," one officer said to Karen, "you can't enforce an HOA that doesn't exist." Her face fell, but she doubled down, insisting I was breaking community laws. The officers, clearly exasperated, advised her to stop wasting their time and left. I thought that would finally silence her, but Karen's determination was unshakable. Karen's next move was bolder than I'd anticipated. She began a smear campaign, plastering flyers around the community accusing me of being a slumlord who refused to maintain community standards. The flyers were laughably amateur, printed on neon pink paper with clip art of angry fists, but they stirred unrest among the tenants. Some, like the Patels, dismissed them, but others, newer renters who didn't know me, started asking questions. I decided to host an open house at the clubhouse to address the rumors and clarify my position. I invited all the tenants, offering coffee and pastries to lighten the mood. To my surprise, nearly everyone showed up, including Karen, who sat in the front row glaring. I explained my role as the landlord, detailing my plans to improve the community, new docks, updated cottages, and a community garden, without any need for an HOA. I emphasized that their rent included maintenance, so no additional dues were necessary. The tenants warmed to the idea, asking thoughtful questions about repairs and amenities. Karen, however, interrupted repeatedly, accusing me of lying to exploit them. I kept my cool, letting her rant until she stormed out, vowing to take this to the county. I followed up with individual meetings, reassuring tenants that Karen's threats were baseless. Most were relieved, but a few remained loyal to her, swayed by her promises of a better community. I dug deeper into Karen's background, curious about her obsession with control. My agent revealed that Karen had been a tenant for 5 years, always paying rent on time, but constantly complaining about her neighbors. She'd tried to start an HOA before, but the previous owner had shut it down. Now, with me as the new owner, she saw an opportunity to seize power. I considered evicting her, but Priya advised against it, citing potential legal backlash. Instead, I decided to let Karen's own actions unravel her influence. I installed security cameras around the community, not to spy, but to document any further antics. Sure enough, Karen was caught on camera tearing down my open house flyers and replacing them with her own. I sent her a polite letter, reminding her that defacing property was grounds for lease termination. She didn't respond, but her flyers stopped appearing. For a brief moment, I thought Karen had given up. The community settled into a peaceful rhythm, with tenants enjoying the lake and planning a group barbecue. I joined them, grilling kebabs and swapping stories, feeling like part of the community for the first time. But Karen wasn't done. She escalated her campaign by filing a complaint with the county zoning board, claiming I was running an illegal rental operation without proper permits. The complaint was laughable. I'd secured all necessary permits when I bought the property, but it forced me to attend a hearing. The zoning board, a group of tired bureaucrats, quickly dismissed Karen's claims after reviewing my documents. They warned her against frivolous complaints, but she left the hearing undeterred, muttering about taking it to the state. I was starting to admire her persistence, even if it was delusional. Back at Lake Serenity, Karen rallied her small group of supporters, holding secret meetings in her cottage. One tenant, a young lawyer named Sarah, tipped me off. "She's planning to sue you," Sarah said, showing me texts from Karen's group chat. The lawsuit was based on a fabricated claim that I'd violated tenant rights by refusing to recognize the HOA. I thanked Sarah and forwarded the texts to Priya, who prepared a countersuit for harassment if needed. Meanwhile, I noticed Karen's cottage was undergoing unapproved renovations, new shutters, a repainted fence, and a garish fountain in the yard. I sent her a formal notice, citing the lease agreement that required landlord approval for modifications. She responded with a venomous letter, accusing me of targeting her for standing up for the community. I ignored it, focusing instead on the other tenants, who were increasingly vocal about their frustration with Karen's antics. The barbecue had fostered a sense of unity, and many began openly defying her rules, planting unapproved flowers and parking kayaks wherever they pleased. Karen's influence was crumbling, but she had one final card to play. Karen's last stand came in the form of a petition signed by her 5 loyal followers, demanding that I recognize the Lake Serenity HOA or face a tenant strike. The petition was delivered to my agent, who forwarded it to me with a note. "She's losing it." I read the petition, amused by its dramatic language, claiming I was destroying the soul of the community. I decided to confront Karen directly, scheduling a meeting at her cottage. When I arrived, she was waiting on her porch, her arms crossed, her fountain gurgling obnoxiously behind her. "Karen," I began, "this has gone far enough. There is no HOA, and your petition has no legal standing. I'm your landlord, and I'm asking you to stop." Her eyes widened at the word landlord, and for the first time I saw doubt flicker across her face. "You're lying," she said, but her voice wavered. I showed her the deed to her cottage, my name clearly listed as the owner. She stared at it speechless, then accused me of fraud. I left her with a warning. Cease her campaign or I'd have no choice but to terminate her lease. The next day, Karen called the police again, this time claiming I'd threatened her. The same officers arrived, visibly annoyed, and after hearing my side, they advised Karen to seek legal counsel if she had legitimate grievances. She didn't. Instead, she doubled down, sending emails to every tenant, accusing me of abusing my power. I responded with a community-wide email, attaching copies of the property deeds and a clear explanation. I owned Lake Serenity, and there was no HOA. The tenants, now fully aware of the truth, began distancing themselves from Karen. Her followers dwindled to 2, and even they seemed hesitant. I offered Karen a chance to stay, provided she stopped her campaign and removed her unapproved renovations. She refused, insisting she'd fight me in court. Priya prepared the eviction notice, citing her lease violations, and I had it delivered by a process server. Karen's reaction was predictable. She tore it up and threw it in the lake. The eviction process was smoother than I'd expected. New York law required a 30-day notice for lease violations, and Karen's unapproved renovations and harassment provided ample grounds. She hired a lawyer, a sleazy type who sent me a cease and desist letter, claiming I was retaliating against her for exercising her rights. Priya dismantled the letter in a single phone call, pointing out that Karen's actions violated her lease and that her lawyer's claims were baseless. The tenants, now fully on my side, began sharing stories of Karen's bullying, finding a single mother for her son's bicycle, threatening an elderly man with legal action for his bird feeder, and even trying to ban a family's dog for excessive barking. I organized a second community meeting, this time without Karen, to discuss the future of Lake Serenity. The tenants proposed ideas for improvements, A new playground, better lighting, a communal boat dock, all of which I promised to fund without any HOA dues. The atmosphere was electric, a stark contrast to Karen's oppressive meetings. Meanwhile, Karen barricaded herself in her cottage, refusing to acknowledge the eviction notice. She posted on social media, calling me a tyrant and rallying support from outside the community. A few local activists showed up, picketing outside my cottage with signs reading, "Save Lake Serenity." I invited them in, showed them the deeds, and explained Karen's campaign. Most apologized and left, embarrassed. Karen's court date arrived, and she represented herself, ranting about community rights while the judge reviewed my evidence. The ruling was swift. Karen had 48 hours to vacate or face forcible removal. She left the courtroom in tears, vowing revenge, but her fight was over. Karen's departure was a spectacle. She hired a moving van and spent her final day yelling at anyone who passed her cottage, accusing them of betraying her. The tenants, now free from her influence, watched with a mix of relief and amusement. I offered to refund her security deposit if she left quietly, but she refused, leaving behind her tacky fountain and a half-painted fence. Once she was gone, I had the cottage inspected and found it in disarray, holes in the walls, unauthorized wiring, and a leaking sink. The repairs cost me a few $1,000s, but it was worth it to reclaim peace. I rented the cottage to Sarah, the young lawyer who'd tipped me off, at a discounted rate as thanks. She moved in with her golden retriever, and the community welcomed her warmly. I installed a new community board in the clubhouse, where tenants could post ideas and concerns directly to me, bypassing any need for an HOA. The board filled up quickly with suggestions for lake cleanups, potlucks, and even a fishing tournament. Lake Serenity was thriving, its spirit restored. I reflected on Karen's obsession with control, wondering what drove her. Maybe she'd felt powerless in her own life and saw the HOA as a way to reclaim authority, or maybe she just loved the drama. Either way, her absence was a gift. I spent more time at the lake, getting to know the tenants and their stories. The Patels invited me for chai, sharing tales of their childhood in Gujarat. Sarah organized a book club, and even the shy retiree in Cottage 8 started joining our barbecues. The community was no longer just a business, it was a home. With Karen gone, I expected smooth sailing, but real estate is never that simple. A few weeks later, I received a letter from a lawyer claiming to represent a Lake Serenity Residents Coalition, demanding I reinstate the HOA. The letter was signed by one of Karen's former followers, a man named Greg who'd quietly supported her campaign. I called Priya, who traced the lawyer to a friend of Karen's from a neighboring town. It was a last-ditch effort to revive her cause, but it lacked teeth. I invited Greg to meet, hoping to avoid another legal headache. He arrived at my cottage nervous but defiant, repeating Karen's talking points about community standards. I showed him the same deeds I'd shown Karen, explaining that an HOA required my approval as the landowner, which I'd never give. Greg backed down, admitting he'd been swayed by Karen's promises of a better community. He apologized, and I let it go, asking him to spread the word that Lake Serenity was fine without an HOA. To ensure lasting peace, I updated all the lease agreements, adding a clause explicitly prohibiting tenants from forming or enforcing an HOA. The tenants signed without complaint, happy to avoid another Karen. I also invested in community events, hosting a lake cleanup that drew volunteers from beyond Lake Serenity. The local paper covered it, painting me as a benevolent landlord, a stark contrast to Karen's slumlord flyers. I didn't care about the publicity, but it helped solidify the tenants' trust. Lake Serenity was now a model community, proof that cooperation didn't need a dictator. A year later, Lake Serenity was unrecognizable in the best way. The new docks were a hit, the community garden bloomed with roses and tulips, and the fishing tournament became an annual tradition. I visited often, no longer just a landlord but a neighbor. The tenants nicknamed me Captain Khan, a nod to my love for kayaking. Karen, I learned, had moved to a condo in the city where she was reportedly trying to start another HOA. I wished her luck. She'd need it. My experience with her taught me the importance of staying engaged with my tenants, not just as a businessman, but as part of their community. I hired a local manager to handle day-to-day issues, ensuring no one felt unheard. The community board overflowed with ideas, from yoga classes to a kids' summer camp. I funded most, dipping into profits because I believed in the vision. Lake Serenity wasn't just a property anymore. It was a living, breathing community,